Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our October 27th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler. As farmers wrap up their 2025 harvest, we know they'll be turning their attention to next year's crop. And that process often includes important conversations with landlords. Today, we're bringing you two experts to help you engage in those discussions effectively. Erin Herbold-Swalwell is a Farm Bureau attorney with extensive experience in the areas of farm succession and landowner relations. And Catherine DeLong of Iowa State University Extension specializes in helping farmers and landowners have helpful conversations about conservation. With today's farm margins, it's even more important for crop farmers and their landlords to be on the same page regarding the financial challenges facing farms and the investment needed to continue protecting our land and natural resources. We'll kick things off with attorney Erin Herbold-Swalwell, who recently sat down with Spokesman editor Tom Block.
Erin, thanks for joining me to talk about farmland leases. Let's start with the big picture. As farmers start winding down their harvest, what are the key things that they should be thinking about in terms of farmland lease negotiations and renewals?
You know, it's this time of year when we're winding down harvest that we always start thinking about those things we haven't thought about, during our busy times. And so I think one of the things you start looking at as far as farm leasing is, A, has your lease been terminated? And B, if it hasn't been terminated, do we want to still try to change the terms of the lease a little bit between the farmer and the landowner? That's something that comes up pretty frequently. Many landowners will just, out of practice, if they have 1-year leases, they'll send a termination notice prior to September 1. And if that happens, then obviously, you're going back to the table to kind of renegotiate things. Maybe not a lot will change, maybe some things will change, but I think it's just an opportunity to kind of revisit the arrangement that you have. Now, if your lease wasn't terminated and it's rolling over for another year or it's a multi-year lease, then it's just a good opportunity, too, to sit down and talk with the landowner and think through some of those things that maybe we could change, with the commodity prices and the yields with the southern rust and some of the issues that we've had this year. I think it makes sense to at least sit down and look at it with the landowner and give them some information on, hey, here's how it's going. So that's what I would be doing.
As you talk about termination, and that doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be a positive thing. It's just a course of doing business.
It is, yeah. I think sometimes people get concerned about, oh gosh, I got a termination notice from my landlord. Typically, those are maybe go along with a letter or a call from the landowner saying, hey, we still want to do business with you. We just want to make sure that we've crossed our T's and dotted our I's and complied with the termination law. So it can be a real positive, actually, especially in an environment like we have right now, to go back and say, hey, maybe we need to think about a flexible lease, or maybe we need to think about some type of bonus arrangement or something like that to get us through the next few years. You could even start talking about conservation improvements that you could do that maybe would add some value to the landowner's holdings, but would also be something that you could contribute in lieu of some cash rent or something like that. So it's just a good opportunity to sit down.
And as you've mentioned, this was a low margin year for a lot of folks. Input prices are still relatively high, and some of our yields didn't quite hit the mark of what we were anticipating or hoping for. So what kind of information should farmers bring to the table as they start to have these conversations to kind of back up and let their landlord know what the financial situation actually is?
Yeah, I think it's just being well prepared, right? We talk about this all the time, that having your information, having it well organized, here were my yields, these were the input prices, just having that organized and in kind of a simpler form for the landowner to take a look at is really helpful. So they get the broader picture of what's going on. I think in today's day and age, sometimes we tend to, oh, here, I'll just email this to you, right? Well, I think there's still some real value in having that face-to-face conversation with your landlord and just saying, here's what's going on with us. Here's what's going on with our operation. Here's some things that I think could improve yields next year, or some things we'll do if this same situation happens next year. And I think having that in-person conversation is really important. So whether that happens over the holidays or whenever that happens, or at least a phone call, I think is still very important. So, just getting your data in order. Sometimes you may have to go hunting for some of that, but I think in today's age, that data is pretty readily accessible, whether it's through the co-op or it's through your own records or yield monitors or things like that. So I think just gathering that and having it in a usable form for them is pretty important.
As you said, these leases can take a lot of different forms in terms of flex arrangements, crop share, straight cash rents, and the length of the lease can vary. So talk about those things a little bit, and then also some of those other factors that could go into a lease, as you mentioned, such as conservation practices, crop residue removal, and how those items might affect the structure or content of a lease.
Yeah, so when you look at your standard Iowa State Bar Association form lease, or you look at the Iowa State Extension leases, they have the short form and the long form, right? And a lot of folks, if you're doing a written lease, which, by the way, highly encourage that. And I think that just makes for a better arrangement all around. But I think it's those little things that you sometimes forget. It could be who has access to the crop residue. So in Iowa, you have to specify that. So the tenant has it unless the landlord wants to keep it. So, what is your plan with FSA? Make sure you're talking through all of those things. Thinking through if you do have some type of cash rent structure with a bonus or a flex arrangement there, make sure that that's working for you. Hunting rights, that's something that we don't think about often, but in Iowa, the tenant has full use and possession of that farm during the pendency of the lease. And so if the landowner wants to reserve those rights, they need to talk to the farmer about it. And so those are things that just get lost a little bit along the way. Another thing I would encourage folks to do would be look at maybe doing a longer term lease with your landowner. And so a lot of times that may look like, hey, we've always done this 1 year rollover lease, and we'd really like to make sure we're getting the fertility levels where they need to be. Can we look at some type of longer term arrangement, whether it's 3 to 5 years, something like that? One thing to remember, if you're going to have a 5-year lease in Iowa, you do need to record that for that to be enforceable under Iowa law. So just make sure if you got one of those long-term 5 years or more leases that is being recorded if you want to make sure that those terms are valid beyond that. So a lease can go up to 20 years. So under the Iowa law, the Iowa Constitution, leases can only go up to 20. Those are your parameters. I think for a younger farmer, you may actually start looking at, could we potentially look at crop sharing? And that may be advantageous for both parties, especially if it's the senior generation getting the younger generation back involved in the farm. Maybe you're looking at a crop share arrangement to try to get them going. And as always, what about taxes? Are there tax benefits in Iowa that retired farmers can take advantage of? So we do have some tax benefits that those retired farmers, and of course you have to meet the definitions of that, but that you can take advantage of that actually may help with getting that younger farmer started. So just being informed and going to those landowner sessions if you want to make yourself more informed about that, going to Ag Decision Maker website on the ISU Extensions site. That's very helpful. A lot of information is contained on that site. So just use everything you have. And in here at Farm Bureau, we provide that information as well.
And there are probably as many different kinds of lease and terms as there are farms out there. Everybody's situation is a little bit different, but over the years of your experience, Are there one or two things that's often overlooked when farmers and landlords get together to talk about these things that you can bring, like just, hey, keep this in the back of your mind or don't forget about this?
Yeah, I think, conservation improvements, right? Let's just say maybe you have some of that equipment on your farm to be able to improve your own farm. Is that something that you can do? Can you look into potential conservation measures or cover crops, things like that are kind of newer ideas that maybe a landowner would look at and say, hey, you're really improving the long-term outlook for my farm. You're improving the land as we go. So that's adding value. So I think make sure that you are really clear with the landowner about those things that you are doing. Hey, we fixed a waterway this year. That adds to your land value. That's not something that we are going to take away, when this lease ends. So talking about those things, just making sure the little things are clear. Are you going to bale corn stalks? So again, who has the right to the residue of the crop? And is that something the landowner really wants to retain or not? And those are the things I think over the years when I've seen little disputes that come up over farm leases, those are the things that people may argue about. And I think making sure you have it in writing is the most important thing, because as you know, in a court of law, if you did get to that point where a feud escalated to that point, everything's admissible for the most part. So your text messages, between farmer and landowner, things that have been said over email, those types of things. So just make sure that you're not agreeing to new and additional things in writing on places where you may not even think you're doing that, like email or text and those types of things. The other thing is make sure you get the parties to the lease correct. That's one little thing that, we have farm families that maybe operate their farms through LLCs or other business entities, yet the actual tenant that's listed on the lease is the person, the farmer. And so if you want that lease to run down to that next generation, maybe the best thing is to have the lease run through the LLC. And so that can become really important. It's just one of those things that doesn't seem like a big deal when everybody's getting along and we're talking to each other and things are good. But when you get to times of stress or maybe a little dispute arises, it's those little things that can really blow that up into a big issue. So that's just a few things I've noticed.
And you've mentioned the importance of having that lease consider the next generation and maybe bringing those younger people in your family to the table, or at least letting them know what the terms are, because a lot of times a lot of family dynamics are dad just handles that, dad'll set the terms or whatever, but then something may happen, or just when he's ready to retire, the next generation isn't prepared to have those conversations. So just talk a little bit about the importance of having it being a generational approach.
Yeah, I think that's interesting you bring that up, because if you're thinking about your long-term succession plan as a farm family, one of the things that we hear, Amanda Van Steenwyck and I get to take part in the Take Root program that we do, which is our farm succession planning workshops. Some of the comments that we hear from the senior generation or the younger generation or even the middle is one party's always taking care of different things on the farm. And, that's their thing and we let them do their thing. Well, what happens when, God forbid, we have a death in the family or an accident or something like that? You really do have to be thoughtful about the long-term strategy for your succession plan. And so I think bringing that next generation with you to some of these meetings is going to be really important. And also, I think one thing we hear from landowners is, well, I'm not sure what's going to happen in the future with this farmer. So I don't know the kids, or I don't know who's going to take over. And so we hear that often. And I think the best way to combat that is to make sure that next generation is involved. Even if they're not completely back on the farm yet, have them involved in those discussions. That goes for a lot of other things too. Like when you have your crop insurance meeting or when you have your property and casualty meeting with your insurance agent, all of those things, bringing that next generation in is going to be really important for your operation.
So let's look at the timeline here for the next few months. As we mentioned, harvest is kind of, hopefully for a lot of folks, winding down into those finishing stages. So after harvest, what are the first steps a farmer should take, and when should they start discussing next year's lease with their landlords if they haven't started having those conversations already?
Yeah, I think this is the perfect time before the holidays get busy to have those discussions. A lot of us, I think we tend to, oh gosh, well, the next crop year doesn't start till March 1. We have the winter months to have these conversations. But if you really are in that situation where, gosh, maybe we didn't terminate the lease, but we'd sure like to talk about a few little changes, I sure would be having those conversations now rather than in February. And so I think that makes a lot of sense to at least start the discussion now. Maybe people are home for the holidays if you have those out-of-state landowners. Having those talks now and getting the signed agreement done prior to the beginning of the year is really smart to do. And so if you don't have that tradition, maybe make that your new tradition of meeting a little bit earlier on those things.
And if people have questions or feel like they need a little bit of extra help, where can they go for help? Are there some online resources that they can go get an idea or just turn to their trusted advisor, attorneys, people like that?
I think every farmer really has a team, right? So they've got their attorney, which maybe that helps with the actual lease drafting or some thoughts on that. You've got your accountant. Never forget to talk to your accountant or your tax preparer. And, with attorneys and accountants, we have a lot of retirements and things like that happening. So if you're having trouble finding those professionals, that's something that we talk to members about quite frequently here at Farm Bureau. And so just thinking through who is my trusted team of advisors. And so that may be your financial advisor. It's probably your banker. Use the online resources that you can. And I mentioned Ag Decision Maker through ISU Extension. A lot of good information on that site. And also information we provide here at Farm Bureau through the Spokesman. I think just talking to your fellow farmers too, that's something, I learn something different every day when I go up to the shop and talk with my dad and talk with other farm families that stop by there. And there's always room for change, right? And there's always room for doing something a little bit different. So just having those discussions, making sure you're not isolated in those decisions is probably really important.
Absolutely. We always say that farmer to farmer network is where the learning really happens. So that's very good advice. Erin, in addition to farm lease negotiations, there's a whole bunch of other issues kind of swirling around out there. What else should farmers be thinking about in terms of tax planning, farm succession, as you've mentioned, energy contracts, things such as those?
There are a lot of other things going on, Tom. There's never any shortage of new things that we see, I think, come across our members' plates, So let's think about, we've talked about succession planning. Always a good time to do that and think about that more in depth over the winter months. Taxes, it's a really good time right now to make your appointment with your tax preparer. We have the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or the OBBBA, as some have referred to it. And so I think the overarching comment I would have about that tax bill is that we do now have some permanency, and I use that in air quotes kind of, Tom, because Congress can always make different decisions or pass new laws. But I think as much as we can have permanency in the tax code right now, we kind of have it. From an estate tax perspective, we have the highest exclusion amounts that we've had. $15 million per spouse is the exclusion for federal estate and gift tax. And so now maybe the focus should be on, okay, maybe we don't have a tax problem when we pass or when we're doing gifting to our family members, but we need to think about the other things that come up with taxes, income tax, planning for the next 3 years, having those conversations with our accountants. I think the other thing that I see coming up, and I think a lot of people around here would echo that, is these energy contracts or leases, easements, where a company will come in and, maybe it's a solar energy group that comes in and they want the right to be able to use your property to install solar panels, or maybe it's wind turbines or pipelines, whatever. I think never hesitate to reach out to your team, like I talked about before. So talk to your accountant about those things. Talk to your attorney. A lot of times these companies that come around, they'll first start with an agent, somebody that they've hired to come talk to farmers about these things, or landowners. And I think whether or not that's your landlord that's having those discussions or it's you as the farm owner, I think really looking into those contracts and really trying to see, okay, what is the benefit, kind of doing that cost benefit analysis, and what do these terms mean, right? Because all these contracts are drafted by lawyers. So, when you talk to lawyers, of course, we can have those discussions and talk about all the legal terms. But when you don't see that every day, it's not something that is familiar to you. So talk to your attorney. Some of these companies will offer money to actually help you hire an attorney to have those discussions. So don't be afraid to do that. As far as any other legal issues, I think winter months are just a really good time to get ahead of the planning. And if you can do that, along with taking a little downtime, I think you're going to be in really good shape for the next few years.
Yeah, definitely take advantage of this time of year to take a little break, but also these meetings that are coming up. I know you and Amanda, as you mentioned, are on the agenda for the Iowa Farm Bureau annual meeting, so we'll put a little plug in for that.
Yes,
and learn more about that.
Yeah, we're pretty excited about that. It's definitely a passion of mine to talk about these issues of succession planning and how do we get families to talk to each other. And I think we all have the best intentions in that regard. It's just sometimes we need a little bit of help on how do we get it to that next step. And so that's what we're here for, to try to help folks with that.
Thanks, Erin. These farmer-landlord discussions aren't always the easiest ones to have, but it's a little easier when you have a bit of a roadmap from someone who's an expert in this area. So we appreciate Erin offering us some sage advice to keep in mind. And if you'd like to hear more from Erin, you heard Tom mention that she's speaking at Iowa Farm Bureau's upcoming annual meeting and our Take Root workshops for farmers over the winter. We've included links for you to learn more about annual meeting and those Take Root workshops, and to get signed up for them down in the notes for this podcast episode. Of course, we all know that farmers have more than just next year's crop in mind when they're sitting down with their landlords. They're thinking ahead, considering the sustained effort and investments needed to help the farm, the land, and the surrounding natural resources thrive into the future. To help farmers broach these important topics with their landlords, Spokesman editor Tom Block recently spoke with ISU Extension Water Quality Program Manager Catherine DeLong.
Hi, Catherine. Thanks for joining me. Start off with here, can you tell me a little bit about your role as Water Quality Program Manager at Iowa State and how that connects you with farmers and landowners out there in the state?
Sure. I'm the Water Quality Program Manager for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. In that role, I work a lot with farmers and landowners on conservation practices. I also do trainings for the conservation professionals who help farmers and landowners. And then another part of my job that I've spent a lot of time in is working on private well water and helping folks who have wells understand that they should be testing it. My kind of connection to farmers and landowners is that I give a lot of presentations about conservation practices and their utility on the land, but I also have a program specifically for landowners, just trying to help them kind of take the lead on having those conservation conversations.
That's what we want to talk about today, is that connection between farmers and landowners and putting conservation on the farm. And it's a big topic. Over half of the farmland in Iowa is rented. So what challenges do farmers face when they want to implement some water quality or conservation practices on rented land?
You're absolutely right. So about 58% of our farmland in Iowa is leased. So it's farmed by someone who doesn't necessarily own it. And we're seeing that landowners really have varying connections to the land. Some know a lot about farming and some don't. And so if a tenant wants to begin this conversation with their landlord, a lot of times it's just really starting out and making sure that everyone's on the same page, bringing some resources to help them understand what you're talking about, how the farm's doing, making sure that everybody is on the same page. So I think just initiating that conversation is really important, and taking the time to explain why you're recommending what you're recommending. We also see that landlords have increasingly complex ownership arrangements. So it isn't just one landlord who owns the land, it's them and their 6 siblings or something like that. And so that's why making sure that everyone is really clearly communicating about what you're thinking about and why you want to do it, because that message is going to get passed from one person to another. And so it's really helpful to be really clear about that, and ideally to put those recommendations into a written lease.
How can farmers really start that conversation if they don't know how to approach landowners? You emphasize the importance of clear communication, but what are some tips, or how do they go about making that initial conversation with the landowner?
The first thing I think is not to put too much pressure on just one conversation. Just say you'd like to meet with them. It can be great to bring them out to the property, show them what you're looking at. You can talk about some of your concerns. And especially if they're not really very much involved in the farm, pointing out what you're talking about. As a farmer, you're going to have so much knowledge about the land and what you're seeing, but sometimes we use a lot of jargon, and that may not translate to someone who just doesn't have that much understanding about the land. And so taking them out to the property can be helpful, explaining to them what you're seeing. And again, not putting too much pressure on that first conversation. It should be a relationship. You should be checking in with them, keeping them updated. So that first conversation, it's often ideal not to ask for anything, and really just to make sure you have a good relationship and then build on that conversation to make sure you're both on the same page about how the land is being managed.
And on the other side of that conversation, what are some of the typical concerns or questions that landowners have when they're approached about these practices?
It really depends. Some of the typical questions would really be around, what is the practice? What are some of the benefits? What are the long-term benefits? What are the short-term benefits? How much is this going to cost? Being really clear with each other too. I'm fully supportive of landowners playing a financial role in adopting some of these conservation practices. And so you can discuss how you're going to break down the costs. So maybe the landlord pays for seed for cover crops, but the tenant is the one who puts it in the field. Maybe it's the landlord who applies for cost share. Lots of different ways to break down that relationship, but making sure that everyone is clear about what the costs are and what the benefits are, and just knowing that there's flexibility there.
Yeah, what conservation practices are maybe the easiest to start with for a beginning relationship, or the most impactful on a rented land type of situation?
I would say in terms of which ones are the most impactful and the easiest, sometimes those are different conversations, but the easiest ones to start with are probably around tillage. That's something that's pretty intuitive to a landlord, is the impact that tillage has on a field. But it's always a good idea to reiterate why farmers till, what some of the benefits are, but then to have a conversation around how can you decrease tillage, explaining to the landlord that if I decrease tillage, that can help deal with long-term compaction, that can help to improve the pore space in the soil, that can help with moisture retention. Kind of explaining some of those things to them, I think, is really important. So tillage is probably a good place to start. That's pretty intuitive for everyone. But then when we start to think about impactful, if you grow corn and soybeans in our state, it's really important to be thinking about where cover crops fit into your operation. And so I know sometimes I forget when I'm having conversations about cover crops that that word doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. And so explaining that, we're thinking about cover crops. We want to do cereal rye ahead of soybeans. Some of the benefits of that are it can help decrease erosion. It can help with weed suppression in the field. Just explaining some of those benefits to them and what the short-term benefits are, like weed suppression, what the long-term benefits are, like reduced erosion, because that land is their legacy. And so helping them understand why decreasing erosion on the field is so important.
And there's certainly a lot of buzz or coverage on things like cover crops, but also important to have the conversations about where cover crops or any other conservation practice might work here, but might not work there. Is that important to have that conversation as well?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to help the landowner understand that especially when you're getting started with cover crops. You probably want to start small. You probably want to start ahead of soybeans. And you really want to help them understand that it can take, a couple years to get comfortable with it and make sure that it's working for your field. And so we really don't see, especially ahead of soybeans, a yield impact, but helping them understand that there may be a yield impact as you're getting going. There may be some changes that you need to make in terms of when you apply nitrogen, not necessarily like changing the overall volume that you apply, but you may need to change timing of it. And so just explaining that this leads to changes in the field and different field operations at different times can be helpful.
And these practices, conservation practices, really do have a long-term benefit for not only the farmer who's farming it and hopefully getting some increased yields, but also long-term benefit to those landowners, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We see lots of benefits with cover crops. Of course, that does depend on how well established they are, how much, biomass you can get in the field. But some of the long-term benefits, I always like to talk about the benefits to the soil, but probably the most common thing I hear from farmers is that it allows them to get into the field a little bit earlier. We see it helps with moisture in the field so they can get in a little bit earlier and start planting. We also see good benefits for reducing erosion. And, the organic matter that's eroding away, that's the foundation for all of agriculture. So we certainly want to keep that on the field. And so I've also heard from farmers that they feel that when they take some machinery into a field that has cover crops on it, that it actually just sort of holds the machinery up better. And we can see some of that in terms of, better soil quality, better aggregate stability. The soil is just more stable in a field that has cover crops. And so lots of long-term benefits. And then I certainly want to mention some of the societal benefits of cover crops. So we've had a pretty tough year for water quality and nitrate. And so one of the big things that makes a difference for keeping nitrogen in our farm fields is cover crops. We talked earlier about tillage. Reduced tillage is a great thing to consider, but it does not help us with holding nitrogen on the landscape. In order to do that, we really need living roots in the ground. Keeping those living roots, those cover crops in the field in the spring is really something that can help with keeping nitrogen in the field and limiting it going into our waterways.
And I think it's interesting you brought up when you have these conversations, every situation I think is different in terms of lease arrangements and lease length and who's paying what. So like you said, it's really important to have those conversations. If a farmer wants to make some investments in this conservation, there needs to be that conversation, like you mentioned, on the shared cost and who's paying for what and where the cost share might be coming, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So different tools that you can use to have that conversation. So you mentioned leases. We certainly do encourage everyone to have a written lease, just because that lays out in clear language what everyone is agreeing to. I know a lot of folks rely on handshake agreements, and sometimes transitioning to a written lease can be scary, but writing out clearly and having a recording of everyone's recommendation is there so that we can protect both parties, both the landowner and the farmer. And so we do recommend having a written lease. Lots of different types of leases. So there's cash rent, crop share. That would be another good discussion to have with your landlord. I know that a lot of times when someone is trying cover crops, it might be ideal to have a longer term lease. Maybe you can have a 3-year lease, just so you don't feel so much pressure in that first year as you're getting started with cover crops. So you could talk with your landlord about having a longer term lease. Lots of ways to break down the costs. So if you want to do cover crops, just deciding, okay, the landlord going to apply for cost share? Am I going to apply for cost share? Who will that go to? And a lot of times it is better if the landlord applies for cost share. And there are some cost share that is only available if you own the land. So good to be on the same page about that. And you can break it down so that you're doing a crop share lease so that you're splitting input costs, but splitting the money received. Or you can just do a flex lease and break it down however it makes the most sense for you. But we do recommend that You're just really clear, ideally putting this in the lease, that the landlord is going to pay for cover crop seed every year, and the tenant will be responsible for planting the cover crops and managing them. So just breaking down that relationship, making sure that you're being really clear about what everyone's understanding is.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. There can be a situation, especially with cover crops, where they might not work that first year. So taking some of that pressure off, explaining, well, it didn't rain and that's why the cover crop didn't grow is important to have.
Yeah. And if a landlord is really excited about cover crops and the tenant is not excited, that's an important conversation to have, because you want the cover crop to be successful. And so we don't want a landlord really pushing someone into cover crops when they don't want to do it. Maybe it's a conversation that you have 1 year and build on it and say, okay, next year, I'd really like to do cover crops. Let's start having this conversation and make sure everyone's on the same page. If the tenant is the one initiating this conversation, maybe it's sharing some information with the landlord about why cover crops are important so that they can share with their co-owners of the land, or if it's the landowner leading that conversation, just making sure that they're having it in plenty of time. We certainly don't want someone rushing into this decision, because it does take time to plan this out, make sure it's going to be successful in the field. And so giving these conversations time, making sure it's multiple conversations can be really important.
Now, you mentioned earlier one of your responsibilities is managing a landowner education program. So can you just tell us a little bit about that program, how it came to be, and whether you're seeing landowners, especially maybe landowners who live out of state, are they taking more interest in conservation on that land that they own?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have a program, it's called the Landowner Education Program, and it is something that we started in 2024. It's an educational program for landowners. And the reason we developed it is lots of the things that we're talking about today. So 58% of our land in Iowa is owned by someone who doesn't farm it. They have increasingly complex ownership relationships, and they are farther and farther removed from the farm. And so a lot of times it's easier for the landlord to start these conversations around things like cover crops. But I will tell you that they are really nervous about that. We've had a couple cohorts in this group, and we initially had a lot of speakers who were landowners who had worked with their tenant to do conservation. And what we found is that the landlords wanted to hear from tenants. They were very worried about recommending something that might not be to their tenants' benefit. They didn't want to push them. So that's why this conversation that we're having today about maybe even how a tenant can start those conversations is really important, because I think most landowners do want to do right by the tenant. So making sure that the tenant is happy with what they're recommending is really important. And so this program takes all that into account. And so we have a small group of landowners that we get together every summer, and we take them through information on reduced tillage, cover crops, and then where perennials, so plants that come back year after year, where those can fit in on their farm. And we also talk about the tax benefits of conservation, how to include conservation in your lease, and then also how to have those conversations with your co-owners, with your lawyer, with other stakeholders in the farm. Because as I mentioned, it usually isn't just one decision maker, it's multiple decision makers. So getting them all on the same page is really important. So we've got that program. You can just Google Landowner Education Program and you can find some information on the program. And we'll be opening up our application in February, and we'll be welcoming landowners to a couple of those events in the summer. So yeah, please spread the word if you're able. But Tom, you asked a question about out-of-state landowners. So this educational program that we run is mainly for in-state folks, and that is the majority of landowners. I know we talk a lot about landowners who are out of state. The majority of landowners are still in our state, and they're still relatively close to the property, usually within the same county that they own the land in. But we have talked about having a virtual version of this in future years, where we work with those landlords who are out of state who own land in Iowa, but might be pretty far removed from farming. So how can they support their tenant as they take on something like cover crops or reduced tillage and make sure that they're managing the long-term sustainability of the land?
That's very interesting. And you started this in 2024, so you've had a couple of sessions then. What kind of feedback have you gotten on the program?
Yeah, so we did. We started in 2024, so we'll be starting our third year this summer. And the feedback has been great so far. So I told you that sort of anecdote about how we thought the landlords would want to hear from other landlords, but they want to hear from tenants. I think our program is sort of unique in that it has a cohort model, because at Iowa State Extension, we always want to lead with science. And so we tell them about the science of cover crops and reduced tillage. But a lot of times it isn't necessarily always that they need to be convinced that these conservation practices are important. It's that they need to figure out how to have that conversation, how to initiate that conversation with their tenants. Many of them are scared to alienate their tenant, or they've known them for a long time, and so they just really want to be fair. And I know there are landlords out there who are not like that, but they have not been a part of our program. And so it's been interesting to see that we thought we'd have to really get them up to speed on the science behind these conservation practices and why they're important. And I think that is important, but the main thing that folks seem to need help with is how to have a conversation with their tenant or with their co-owner about what they'd like to do. I think another thing that's been really tough for landlords to figure out is, what does a well-stewarded farm look like? Does it have reduced tillage? Does it have strip till? Does it have cover crops, grass waterways? So there's no straightforward answer to what, a sort of well-stewarded farm looks like. But we try to help them understand that in Iowa, a well-stewarded farm includes reduced tillage, cover crops if you have corn and soybeans, and then also thinking about those edges of the fields. Are there places where you can put perennials, grass waterways, maybe other practices that attach to drainage tiles to clean the water? So giving them sort of a baseline understanding of what a good farm looks like is also something that has been a big part of our program.
Yeah, that's excellent advice. And as you mentioned, the tenant can take them out for a tour of the land and give them the vision to see what it might look like either on other land that they may own, and they can see the practices in action, or really just get a feel for the landscape. So that's really good advice.
I mean, I think just showing your familiarity as the tenant with the land is really helpful to the landlord. Taking them out, showing the impact that you're having on the soil, potentially areas where you're dealing with some issues and how they can help, making them feel that they're, an important part of the operation. I know a lot of the power technically is with the landlord, but tenants have a lot of power to initiate these conversations and help landlords see, the difference that these conservation practices can make on the soil, water quality, habitat benefits, all of the above.
That's good stuff from Catherine. I really like what she had to say about building that relationship with your landlords over time, inviting them out to the farm to actually see and discuss the challenges and opportunities you're seeing. That relationship and shared understanding can go a long way when it's time to discuss collaborating on new conservation efforts as well. If you'd like to learn more about the ISU Extension Landowner Education Program that Catherine mentioned, we've included a link down in the notes for this podcast episode. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you picked up some useful information and that you'll join us for our next episode on November 10th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.